application is in front of the committee, and it's approving with a favourable response to them.
The member for Cape Breton, the Lakes, on his final supplementary.
I thank the honourable ministers for that reply, Mr. Speaker. My next question is to the Minister of Transportation and Public Works. Now that springtime has arrived and, of course, paving season is upon us, I would like to ask the Minister when the good people of Village Drive and Church Road and Bedore, as well as the people in other rural communities throughout Nova Scotia, can expect to see tenders advertised for street improvements in their communities.
The honourable member shifted gears there to the Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
That's kind of appropriate, I guess, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wasn't able to catch the specific reference to the road in question, but I can tell the honourable member that our paving priority is still under discussion, and that we are gradually, over the next month or so, will be finalizing our plans for capital paving projects in all parts of Nova Scotia, including, of course, Cape Breton, the Lakes.
The Honourable the member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Education, Mr. Speaker. As I've talked to him many times regarding subsidence in relation to our schools, Mr. Speaker, this problem is a reality, and subsidence has many serious implications to our public school system in the coalfields of Cape Breton, Mr. Speaker. You know, it's just 2 weeks ago that we had the parents from the Dominion area here talking to the minister, and since they've been here, now there have been 2 more schools that have been found at risk of subsidence. And through that study, it was performed by an engineering group on behalf of the local school board. So I want to ask the minister if he knows the cost of that report, and did the province have any put any money in by way of supporting that study and paying for it?
The Honourable the Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member for the question. The ADI consultants that were employed by the board with respect to the McDonald complex, all of their costs were met by the Department of Education. The exact amount is an amount that I would have to get and give to the honourable member.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, Mr. Speaker, while the study shows that there appears to be no imminent danger at this time, the concerns about the risk to people and their investments in those schools' infrastructure are on the minds of everybody in industrial Cape Breton, Mr. Speaker. We know that the federal government has allowed the mines to flood, and this which makes the engineering study of that subsidence even more difficult now that the mines are flooded, Mr. Speaker, and the assessment are almost impossible. So I want to ask you, what is your plan, Minister, to protect our schools' infrastructure to ensure the safety of students, teachers, other staff in the areas where at risk with subsidence?
The Honourable the Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I can tell the honourable member that we're working very closely with the school board in terms of identifying any areas of concern that may exist. We have also, through the resources of the Department of Natural Resources, obtained significant information that is being made available not only to my department but to the school board to assist in an assessment of those sites that may be of concern.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my final supplementary, I think I'm going to go to the Minister of Natural Resources, Mr. Speaker. You know, many people in the coal fields want answers, and they want them now, Mr. Speaker. I know members of the third parties want to avoid any implication by this by saying that their Liberal buddies in Ottawa have nothing to do. It's purely a provincial matter when it comes to subsidence, Mr. Speaker. But this threat of subsidence is very serious when we think of our school. But it's also of great concerns to many, many homeowners, Mr. Speaker. The potential costs are in the millions of dollars. My question to the minister is, can he tell us if his department has any information on the plans for mitigating the subsidence risks in Cape Breton and some estimates of the cost of such a program?
The Honourable the Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, subsidence will continue to be a problem in the 17 communities throughout Nova Scotia. and it is one that we take very, very seriously. But, Mr. Speaker, I would remind you and all members of the House that prior to 1967, the records clearly show that the private coal mining companies provided compensation and financial assistance to homeowners. In 1967, when DevCo took them over, including the Dominion coal leases, they had a different attitude towards whether or not they had responsibility for subsidence. And under the Mineral Resources Act in Nova Scotia, it is very clear that they are, in fact, responsible for that issue. We have entered into negotiations on a number of issues to do with the return of the leases in Cape Breton, and we're continuing to do that. Mr. Speaker, I would mention that regarding subsidence, the issue was heavily discussed in 1995-96 by the government of the day. There was a proposal put together regarding a subsidence and a resolution of the problem by that government of the day. However, that government of the day chose not to move forward, and as a result, the issue remains one that is being negotiated between the provincial government and the federal government. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable the Member for Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the snow crab fishery in this province is about to come into full swing, and Nova Scotians are asking themselves what the rules of engagement will be this year. Mr. Speaker, on February 21st, 2003, the Minister of Fisheries issued a press release in which the Minister stated, in regards to the trade in unprocessed snow crab from Nova Scotia, quote, Nova Scotia supports free trade of fish and fish products, but restrictions in provinces such as Newfoundland and Quebec make it very difficult for our processors to compete. I've once again asked my provincial colleagues to eliminate these trade barriers, end quote. Speaker, my question to the Minister of Fisheries is that besides asking the other provinces to play fair, could the Minister tell the House what concrete action he has taken to ensure that Nova Scotia crab fishermen and crab buyers are not at a disadvantage to either the provinces of Quebec or Newfoundland?
The Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries responsible for the Public Service Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the member opposite brings an important issue to the floor of the House, and we have taken actions. As was said in its preamble, we are very much in favor of free trade. We entered into discussions with New Brunswick and have resolved the issue in terms of trading agreements with New Brunswick. Because Quebec and Newfoundland continue to be of the view that they do not want to allow our producers and processors to have access to the crab, we have sent forward conditions on license renewals. So we have made it clear to those jurisdictions that we are prepared to take action.
The Honourable the Member for Richmond.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia has always been a free trade advocate, and we would hope that the Canadian provinces around us would do the same. The Minister has just said that he's prepared to take action. The question is, will he take action is what we want to know. Mr. Speaker, it's essential that we allow our crab fishermen to get the best price possible while at the same time allowing processing jobs in our province. Mr. Speaker, communities such as Ilmadam, Canso, Mulgrave, Shettycamp, Neils Harbour, Louisbourg and Glace Bay, to name a few, rely very heavily on the processing of snow crab to provide much needed employment in their communities. And the problem is that this government has failed to take concrete action in the last 4 years to address the unfair trade practices. So my question is, will the Minister assure this House today and those communities affected that unprocessed snow crab from Nova Scotia will not go to Quebec or Newfoundland this summer as long as these unfair trade practices continue?
The Honourable the Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd suggest the member opposite talk to the processors in this area because they've been very supportive of the position that this government has taken. Not only have we sent forward indications that we will act on conditions for license renewal, we've also looked at the interprovincial trade agreement to try to access it, resolve the issue at that level as well.
The Honourable the Member for Richmond.
Well, Mr. Speaker, let me make it clear. We are pleased that the government is indicating that it is willing to take action. Our fear is whether the government will actually take action at the end of the day. The Minister has indicated that he's attached some conditions to the renewal of buyers' licenses, yet he fails to indicate whether those conditions will strictly be enforced in the upcoming season. So I ask the Minister once again, very simply, will you assure Nova Scotians that unprocessed snow crab will not go to the provinces of Newfoundland or Quebec as long as they continue to have trade barriers which go against the interests of Nova Scotians?
The Honourable the Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if that member had actually read the correspondence that was generated, it was clearly indicated that we were willing and prepared to take action. I would also suggest that perhaps he talk to the producers, because the processors, they have indicated to me in conversations that this is the strongest action ever taken by any government related to this particular issue on their behalf.
The member Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question will be for the Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries as well. Mr. Speaker, the Federal Provincial Agricultural Policy Framework, or APF, has generated much controversy. Other provinces have refused to sign, and many more have grave concerns about the APF's redesign for safety net programs. Agreements for these old programs, such as NISA, expired in March, but farmers say the new proposal offers a narrow definition of disaster relief, and too many farmers will not qualify. So my question to the Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries is simple. Do you intend to sign the APF?
The Honourable the Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this government has been working very closely with our other counterparts and with the federal minister to try to revive and redesign this program. Obviously, it needs to be signed by all, and we will assign it at the appropriate time once the outstanding issues have been resolved.
The Honourable the Member for Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll say the short form of that is yes. Mr. Speaker, the Nova Scotia Federation of Agriculture has asked that this government not sign the APF. The Federation says, compared to the old NISA program, this new program is a real disaster. Mr. Speaker, NISA wasn't without its faults, but it appears that it's heads and shoulders above the new package proposed by the federal government. So I asked the Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries, how much consultation have you done with Nova Scotia farmers about this new package?
The Honourable the Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the irony here is that the farming sector did not like the old program. Now that we're coming forward with a new program, they don't like that one either. So the point is that we've reviewed this as a major undertaking of the government federally and in the province, and we're in the process now of doing some modeling specific to this province's farming community so that we have the reassurance that the new program will deal with the outstanding issues, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable the Member for Hants East on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. They didn't like a bad program, so why would they like a worse program? Mr. Speaker, many sectors of our agricultural industry are in a crisis situation following years of drought, low market prices, and other challenges. Program after program has failed to offer real assistance to keep family farms going, and now an even weaker package has been put on the table. So I asked the Minister, what is preventing your department from coming up with a proposal of its own instead of relying on what the federal government hands you?
The Honourable the Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the point of trying to design a program that's tailored to work in conjunction with the federal government is that it will allow us to access their funding as well. This is going to be a very comprehensive program, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's going to expand crop insurance coverage, and it's going to improve the old NISA program with the new NISA program. The issue in part is that the old NISA program was very much seen as a retirement program. In fact, the income stabilization program is designed to do that, to provide income stabilization through times of uncertainty, as the member opposite has brought forward.
The Honourable the Member for Cape Breton South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, 2 weeks ago in the House during question period, I asked the Premier the number of people working in his office with salaries and expense charged to other departments. I asked the Premier to, would he consider tabling a list of those people and their salaries in the House. And I also, during that same question period, Mr. Speaker, I asked the Premier to table a list of his staff and where they are located, whether they're working in his office, Mr. Speaker, or whether they're working in other offices such as the Treasury Department. And I still have not got an answer from the Premier as to whether or not the number of people that are working in his office are actually working there, or rather they're actually working in other departments and charged to other departments, but working in the Premier's office. Would the Premier agree to table a list by question period tomorrow as to the number of people working in his office the salaries of those individuals and what their jobs are?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's a fair request, and I'll comply.
The Honourable member for Cape Breton South.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'd like to thank the Premier for that answer. And by the answer, did he say that he was going to comply with that by tomorrow? Yes. Does that include, Mr. My first...
Order, please. That'll be the first supplementary. The Honourable the Premier. The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And
Order, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe what the member asked is he wanted a list of the people that work in my office and the salary list, and I will comply with that request. Yes, by tomorrow.
Order, please. And yes, I would remind the member for Cape Breton South, he did ask the question whether the Premier had said that he would comply by tomorrow or not. The Speaker didn't hear the Premier say whether he would comply by tomorrow or not, so I thought it only fair to ask the Premier the question again. The Honourable the member for Cape Breton South on his final supplementary.
My final supplementary, Mr. Speaker, is that I asked the Premier 2 weeks ago in the House whether or not there were people working in his office that were charged to other departments of government, because the Premier has said time and time again that his office had less employees than the previous Premier of this province. And what I'd like to know from this Premier is the list of people who are actually paid for by his office, working in his office, and not assigned to other departments of government and actually doing work for the Premier. That's the list that I'd like to get. And I'm asking the Premier for that.
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I can assure the good member from Cape Breton South that's the list he'll receive.
The Honourable the member for Dartmouth North. He has about 7 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question will be to the Minister of Community Services. Thank you.
The Honourable member's time has expired. The Honourable the Minister of Natural Resources on a point of order.
On a point of clarification, Mr. Speaker, in responding to a question from the member from Victoria, there was some question as to the process for contacting the department and the time frames involved. Mr. Speaker, on advice from Department of Health, the actual time frame for contacting the 1-800 number, in fact, does start on May the 20th. So between May 20th and October 31st, members of the public can call the 1-800 number after hours. I would, however, want to clarify one other point, Mr. Speaker, and it is important that we have an ongoing program of retrieving deceased wildlife year-round. And if there are people, if the members of the public believe that there is wildlife, including crows, that they would like to have removed, we certainly will pick them up. And because of the time frame, and it is close to May the 20th, any of those corvids or crows and other birds will, in fact, be retained for review.
Order, please. That doesn't meet the conditions of a point of order, and there are no points of clarification. However, it is Opposition Day, NDP Opposition Day. We move to the...
After question period, ministers were able to get up after their time and to run out during question period to expand upon their answer to try to put a different political spin on it, Mr. Speaker. And I was wondering if we might also be...
Order, please. Would the... order, please. Yes, the Honourable, the member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Would you please call Bill number 30?
Yes, Bill number 30. The Honourable, the member for Hants East. Would the Honourable member for Hants East permit a quick introduction?
Sure.
The Honourable, the member for Queens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to take this opportunity to assist the constituency of Lunenburg West, who unfortunately without an MLA, to introduce an individual who's in the gallery opposite. Ken Edwards is president of the Denturus Society of Nova Scotia, and I'd ask him to stand and receive a warm welcome from the House.
The Honourable member for Cape Breton West on a point of order.
No, Mr. Speaker, on a point of personal privilege.
On a point of personal privilege, the
Yes.
Honourable the member for Cape Breton West. The Honourable member for Cape Breton West understands that if he has an opportunity on personal points of privilege, he is supposed to notify the Speaker in advance, but we will permit this point at this particular time.
Well, Mr. Speaker, not all are contemplated in prepared text, as you can well appreciate. But it's with regards to a presentation that was made by the Deputy Minister of Finance 3 weeks ago before Public Accounts. He gave an undertaking to members of the committee and to the House that he would supply a list of all the user fees and the new user fees that were being charged by the Department of Finance, and we understood that we would have that within a couple of days, and still to date we haven't received that. And we would ask the Minister of Finance.
That does not meet the conditions of a point of personal privilege, and the member said himself that the undertaking was granted or given 3 weeks ago.
With all due respect, if it could at least finish my
The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
And I'm receiving some acknowledgement from at least from the Minister of Finance that he would at least give an undertaking to investigate and report back, perhaps by tomorrow, as to why we are not receiving that information that we were given an undertaking. And in my view, and based on the decisions of previous speakers, any time a member is inhibited from accessing information that's vital to enabling a member to perform his duty, that is an infringement on one's rights.
The Speaker will take that point under advisement and report back to the House. The honourable member for Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm assuming that we're back to Bill 30. I wonder if you can tell me how much time I have, whether that was taken off my time or...
Well, I did recognize the honourable member, and then there was a couple of interventions, and being at NDP Opposition Day, we do have at the tail end, so to speak, 3 or 4 minutes. Would the opposition wish that we added on to the debates?
Well, I'd certainly, if that means I'm going to get my original time, then I say yes.
Well, that's...
Okay, Mr.
Well,
Speaker.
order, please. Then the honourable member could have 3 minutes added on. So instead of going to 4:29, we would perhaps go to 4:32.
Very good. Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, I'm really glad to speak to this bill today, and I would hope that, although there hasn't been any indication that the government has listened before when this bill has been called, but I would like members, certainly members opposite, and I'll be interested to hear what the members from the Liberal caucus say to this bill. But this is a situation that I'd like members to think about in a very clear way, because the forest sector in this province contributes significantly in rural Nova Scotia, and we have every reason to believe that that's not going to happen. The thrust of this piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, is to ban clear cutting as the harvesting practice, the major harvesting practice in the forests of Nova Scotia. It's not to eliminate it completely. What we would like to see, and what this bill is designed to do, is to enhance, actually, or I should say, bring about sustainability of the forest, because I don't believe that that's what we have right now. And that will be done and should be done in 2 ways. This bill addresses one of those, and that is to eliminate clear cutting as the major harvesting practice. We are allowing it by permit as a treatment for those stands which it can be determined that clear cutting would be the appropriate treatment for that particular stand, and thereby the mills or contractors could apply to have clear cutting done on a particular stand as a treatment for that stand. And otherwise, Mr. Speaker, clear cutting would be banned in this province. We harvest approximately 100,000 acres per year in Nova Scotia. Actually, there's 110,000 acres per year are clear cut in this province. The minister would be aware of the species at risk that are in this province, and actually that number of species at risk has doubled under this administration. If the minister doesn't see some connection between clear cutting and the number of species at risk, then I would say that he very sadly is not the minister that should be in place in terms of the Department of Natural Resources. This issue is widespread. The impacts on communities, the impacts on wildlife habitat are significant, and actually the impact on the sustainability of the forest industry is significant. And for whatever reason, members opposite or the minister seem to believe that stewardship agreements or planting of trees, which is, when you talk about silviculture, they only seem to think about planting trees, that this somehow is going to save the forest. And I want to tell the minister that if he was to wake up tomorrow with the whole province cut, that it wouldn't matter how many trees he planted, he's going to be looking at 70 plus years before he'll be thinking of cutting any trees at all. Now, Mr. Speaker, there's been a number of studies done on the forests in the Atlantic area, and some of specifically to Nova Scotia. And back in the 80s, the Royal Commission on Forestry looked at this problem. They come up with some recommendations, and those recommendations were around the implementation of greater funding for silviculture programs in Nova Scotia. The number I'm thinking is $20 million a year. I have heard it as high as 50, but I think that number actually seems too high. But anyway, the result of that, Mr. Speaker, is that we would be to the point of harvesting slightly more than 3 million cords per year in this province by the year 2040, if we had taken the recommendations of that 1984 Royal Commission. Mr. Speaker, we are harvesting presently just about that exact level of harvest, over 3 million cords in Nova Scotia in 2003, and we're roughly 40 years ahead on their predictions for harvest levels, and we haven't put that money into silviculture. That never happened. So if the minister or the department thinks this is sustainable, I'd like to know on what basis they've come to that conclusion. The Canadian Forest Service has done studies in Atlantic Canada and says that we're over-harvesting, but that doesn't seem to be enough for the government. GPI Atlantic has done a study, and they say the exact same thing, that we are over-harvesting and that clear-cutting is having significant damage in terms of watersheds, wildlife habitats, siltation of streams, etc. And I want to give some numbers actually to the members of the House, that in 1984 the forest industry contributed $90,804 per 1,000 cubic meters of timber harvested. $90.8, and by 1999 it was $68 per 1,000 cubic meters, and there was a 25% decrease. So in terms of its contribution to GDP, since 1984, we've had a 25% decrease in the contribution of the forest sector to the GDP, and although our harvest has gone up, the employment in this sector has gone down. Employment per unit of timber harvested has declined by 26% since the 80s, from an average of 1.9 jobs per 1,000 cubic meters in the 80s to an average of 1.4 jobs per 1,000 cubic meters in the 90s. So we're cutting more, we're producing less jobs, and as the technology improves, Mr. Speaker, we will cut even more and more and more. And if in Nova Scotia, if you can sell it, you can cut it. We have no annual allowable cut applied in this province, so there's no limit to what we can produce. A year or so ago, I did some number crunching, and I used the minister's own numbers with this document towards a Nova Scotia wood supply forecast for Nova Scotia 1996 to 2070, and I'll table a copy for the minister. He can get a better one from his department because his would be in color. And Mr. Speaker, in Nova Scotia, for the total forest, and that includes the forest that we operate plus the forest including parks, etc., that area that we do not cut, and the age class in this province of the forest between 60 and 80 years, or 61 and 80 years, is about 32%. And that's 32% of the total forest. That includes the part we're not going to cut. So in terms of the operable forest, which is much smaller, that area that's being harvested, if we assume that we can take that 32% and apply it, we can cut that area of the operable forest in 19 years. According to GPI Atlantic, it's 11%, and that means that we can cut it in about 6 years. And the minister should worry about this, because the calls for alarm have come forward now for some time, Mr. Speaker. The government hasn't been listening to them. They've only listened to the industry, and you cannot allow the vagaries of the market to predict what your sustainability level is going to be, or lack thereof. We have a unique opportunity, and when it comes to forestry, it can go the way of the codfish, but this is an industry where we can see the codfish, Mr. Speaker. We can look at the trees. We know how big the forest is. We can actually determine our level of cut. You just have to do the math and determine how long it would take to cut it. And we cannot sustain the level of harvest that we're carrying out in this province, and we cannot do it by terms of clear cutting. If we can stop clear cutting, we can save habitat, we can actually save jobs, put more men on the ground in the woods in Nova Scotia, smaller technology, smaller machinery, create more jobs. And I want the minister to think he's the minister in charge of emergency measures, applying for disaster relief, and one of the key causes that people believe that we've had so much trouble as far as this recent rainstorm, or that at the 1st of April, they blamed it on clear cutting, that the water was getting to those lower areas much faster than it ever used to. And this is a consideration that the minister should think about, because this has a cost. There is a value in leaving trees standing, and that if you intend to take them all, you're going to have to pay for that, Mr. Speaker. So my recommendations to the government are two. One is stop clear cutting, because it does have a disadvantage for Nova Scotians, for habitat, for siltation of streams, and there is a better way. Nova Scotians have been doing it for a lot of years, and I think the minister has to go back to that. With what we know about silviculture today, we can actually manage our forests far better than this government is doing that, Mr. Speaker. And with those comments, I'll relinquish the floor to the next member.
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I welcome the opportunity to stand up and address the issues related to this bill. Mr. Speaker, the honourable member made a comment in the first of his remarks that he felt perhaps that the current Minister of Natural Resources isn't the guy to be doing the job. Well, Mr. Speaker, I would beg to differ, and I would beg to differ for some very specific reasons. Mr. Speaker, I think the issue of talking about sustainability and clear cutting and all of those issues is something that you have to fully understand the scope of the word sustainability. Mr. Speaker, sustainability is not just whether it's a clear-cut issue or not, and I mean that clear-cutting as in forestry. Mr. Speaker, biodiversity strategy, parks and protected areas strategy, old forest policy, Endangered Species Act, ecological land classification, wildlife habitat protection, not to leave out the Nova Scotia Forest Strategy or the integrated resource management practices of this province. Mr. Speaker, that's what sustainability is all about. You can't narrow the issue of protection of our forests and development of our economy using the forest sector by talking about clear cutting. That's the issue that the honourable member and many of his cohorts love to jump on, because that's the one that they seem to think gets all the press. Mr. Speaker, I would like to make reference to a document, a newspaper article, and I will table a copy, that was written by Steve Talbot, the Executive Director for the Nova Scotia Products Association of Nova Scotia. And in that document, he states, and I quote, "What frustrates the forest industry, woodlot owners, and other members of the Forest Products Association of Nova Scotia is the assumption by the Ecology Action Centre, the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, and the members opposite, I might add, from the previous speaker's party, that only forests that are set aside as parks add value to the environment. But Mr. Speaker, nothing could be further from the truth. Every day in Nova Scotia, forest management plans are carried out that balance economic values with wildlife habitat, biodiversity, water and air quality, and recreation objectives as well. This article goes on to say that the Forest Products Association of Nova Scotia members are committed to sustainable management of Nova Scotia's forests and to continually improving industry practices based on sound science. Mr. Speaker, it continues to say, FPAN leaders, the Forest Products Association Nova Scotia members, lead by example in working and managing community watersheds and forest education and promotion of safe, responsible forest recreation activities. Mr. Speaker, the unfortunate part is that the wrong message gets sent to the world community, and believe me, we do deal in the world community in Nova Scotia with 80% of our forest products being exported. They're going through a very tough time now, and the only thing we don't need is people within this province downgrading and belittling the industry as if it was here to rape and pillage the people of Nova Scotia and the forest that they live in. And that's just an incredible environment that's being created, Mr. Speaker. The province of Nova Scotia is committed to the sustainability of Nova Scotia's forests under the National Forest Strategy Coalition. And Mr. Speaker, I was very pleased to represent the government of Nova Scotia in signing the new Canada Forest Accord in the last couple of weeks in Ottawa. This national strategy, Mr. Speaker, lays the groundwork for Nova Scotia to develop and implement an action plan to meet the commitments outlined in the new accord. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia believes healthy forest ecosystems are essential to the health of life on Earth, of all life on Earth. Continued economic, environmental, and social benefits must be maintained for the communities, families, and individuals who depend on the forests for their livelihood and their way of life. Our forests are an important resource for all Nova Scotians. From an economic perspective, the forest industry in Nova Scotia is valued at $1.4 billion and employs over 20,000 people, Mr. Speaker. Our forests also have an impact on our lives in many other ways, including recreational opportunities. The Department of Natural Resources has a mandate to ensure that our forests are sustainable now and in the future for all generations of Nova Scotians. Sustaining this resource has resulted in several initiatives, including implementation of a provincial forest strategy. The strategy is one of the many links in the whole process of ensuring Nova Scotia's forests are sustainable. Mr. Speaker, other initiatives that contribute to the overall sustainability of our forests include national commitments, a biodiversity strategy, a parks and protected areas strategy, an old forest policy, an endangered species strategy, forest management information, forest inventory information, and the integrated resource management of our Crown lands. Mr. Speaker, since 1997, the Department of Natural Resources has been working toward implementation of the various parts of the forest strategy. Implementation of the strategy and its key elements continue as we work towards sustainable forests and sustainable forest use. We recently introduced the draft framework for a code of forest practices. This document outlines the best management practices and will focus on forest harvest and silviculture, timber management, biodiversity, and environmental protection and multi-use values. The Code of Forest Practice is a government policy that will be mandatory on Crown land, becoming part of planning and operational requirements and voluntary on private lands. Its use will be encouraged on all private forest lands through information and operations. Mr. Speaker, one cannot forget that 75% of the forest lands in Nova Scotia are owned by the private sector. 75%. We are very able and capable and are continuing to promote programs that provide sustainability on the 25% that is Crown. But it's very important that through the Code of Forest Practices and good forest sustainability regulations, that the private sector accept their level of responsibility to support sustainability of our forests. Mr. Speaker, the honourable member talks about clear cutting. The Code addresses forest stand and site conditions under which various methods of harvest are appropriate in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, selection cutting significantly increases harvesting costs and does not necessarily increase growth potential. On the other hand, selective harvesting practices can lead to a high grading of stands and often leave a high risk of blowdown if not expertly done. The majority of stands in Nova Scotia are intolerant hardwood and softwood, in which selection harvesting will not normally give the desired results. We are proposing changes through the forest sustainability regulations that make the regulations easier to follow based on feedback from those who use them. And Mr. Speaker, we expect that through the support process of the private sector on their private woodlots and through the education process from our department that we will be able to achieve the results that expected through the forest sustainability regulations. Mr. Speaker, all forest harvesting methods change wildlife habitat. Some species prefer openings, while others prefer forest cover. The average clear-cut size in Nova Scotia is about 15 acres. A few large clear-cuts are desirable to establish the growth of large forest stands as habitat for forest interior species such as goshawks, lichens, insects, and spiders. Clear-cutting is a valuable harvesting method in many forest stands that resulted from previous poor management practices. This allows stands with low productivity to be renewed through natural regeneration or planting if necessary. In addition, Mr. Speaker, and something that's never mentioned by the member opposite or his cohorts, planting has the benefit of restoring the species that belong on the site that may no longer be there. That's called restoration of ecosystems, Mr. Speaker, something that we don't get credit for doing, but which we're very much involved in. In certain ecosystems, clear-cutting mimics the natural processes of fire, blowdown, insect, and disease. Limiting clear-cutting will result in a much more extensive network of roads and harvesting over a much more extensive area to supply the existing industry with the same amount of fiber. Mr. Speaker, we don't hear the Ecology Action Centre or the member opposite talking about the fact that if you don't do the clear-cutting, you have to build more roads, you have to destroy more habitat to get at the forests in smaller groups, when in fact that end result will not produce a sustainable forest in Nova Scotia. We do not regulate harvest techniques or how private landowners manage the wood on their land. Forest sustainability depends on achieving a balance among the use, management, and preservation of our forest resources, recognizing environmental values and ecosystems characteristics, and as well, Mr. Speaker, managing the risk of uncertainty by not compromising future opportunities. The road we are taking with our forest strategy allows for public, government, and industry to work together to achieve a strong forest sector, a varied and productive forest, informed public and landowners, and sustainable forest management practices. Mr. Speaker, in Nova Scotia, we have a program called the Integrated Resource Management Program, which allows us to, on an ongoing basis, identify various characteristics of the land base in Nova Scotia, which helps us determine what kind of clear cut, select cut, or any other kind of cut would be best suitable for the land in question. And Mr. Speaker, this is working out very well. We have a lot of cooperation from the private sector related to the Integrated Resource Management Program. It is in fact helping them identify other resources on their land that they previously may have considered only being forestry. And through that process, the Integrated Resource Management process, Mr. Speaker, we have been able to identify mineral resources. We've been able to identify endangered species. We've been able to identify old-growth forests and many other characteristics that are very important to the sustainability of the overall forest sector. Mr. Speaker, wildlife habitat protection is a very important part and results from the integrated resource management. The Wildlife Habitat Protection Program is involved and runs in parallel in many cases to the Watercourses Protection Act, because it in fact allows us to provide clear stands of trees when forests are being harvested along waterways. It allows us to the opportunity to leave large clumps within forestry harvested areas for the animals and the birds in the woods to survive and reproduce. and reduce any possible opportunities for extinction. It's extremely important. Again, Mr. Speaker, I go back to my original statement. It's extremely important that members of the opposition and the Ecology Action Centre and the Coalition and others clearly understand that clear-cutting is not the only issue in Nova Scotia, and that they have to start recognizing that the Department of Natural Resources for many years, and hopefully for many years to come, will continue to provide opportunities for development of the lands in Nova Scotia, both particularly in Crown land, but in educating those on private lands, provide opportunities for the ongoing development and sustainability of the province's forests. Mr. Speaker, we have a tremendous asset in this province in our forests. We have companies like Stora in Port Hawkesbury who have so much faith in this province that they are turning around and investing an additional $90 million in a business in Nova Scotia that will employ hundreds of people, both directly and indirectly. Mr. Speaker, international companies like Stora Forests do not, I repeat, do not spend that kind of money in a province that is doing what the honourable member would like other people to believe to its forests. It doesn't do that. It's here because they know we look after our forests, and we'll continue to do that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Victoria.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, for a few moments I am taking an opportunity to speak on Bill 30. Mr. Speaker, as a former minister, I have to try to find a neutral track between the two parties, and I'm going to attempt to do that. And after listening to the Minister of Natural Resources speak very eloquently, I might add, on the policies and the practices that's carried on with the Department of Natural Resources today, I'm happy that probably a lot of that began in 1997 when we introduced the paper towards a sustainable forestry. Mr. Speaker, I think it's fair to say that all three parties in the House today are much in favour of sustainable forestry and sustainable forest practices. And the question that arises today is whether this particular bill is important to ensure the health of our forests. Mr. Speaker, I don't agree with a full ban on clear cutting. Mr. Speaker, which this bill is essentially advocates. This is basically what this bill is all about. Because I believe, Mr. Speaker, it's probably a knee-jerk reaction based more on emotion rather than fact. Mr. Speaker, there are many things there are many shortcomings in the department's activities, and they're particularly in terms of monitoring the practices that are happening today. There are areas of this province, especially such as old-growth forests, which should be protected. But to ban clear-cutting because it makes people feel good, Mr. Speaker, I believe it's not the way to go. And I want to take, for an example, the forest practices in Sweden. And I had an opportunity when I was a minister to tour some of the forests in Sweden with members of our staff and members from Stora. And they're at least, Mr. Speaker, 20 years ahead of us in terms of forest practices. They have a very healthy forest, and they have very healthy wildlife. But, Mr. Speaker, they do clear cutting, but, Mr. Speaker, it's monitored. And I think this is where this government falls short, is that we don't monitor the practices that's happening. The minister has made reference to the large volume of our forest today that's privately owned. I think he said 75%, which I agree is probably the correct number. And there's a large part of that, Mr. Speaker, that falls under protected area. Probably another 20% maybe of that 25 is under protected area.
But, Mr. Speaker, Sweden and Norway are probably, Mr. Speaker, the most environmentally aware countries in the Western world. They take pride in their natural habitat, but even in Sweden, clear-cutting is widely practiced. As well, instead of taking a highly regulated approach, Sweden has worked hard to get its harvesters to agree to practice sustainable forest management. And this is what we go back, as I go back to my earlier statements. We must monitor what's happening out there. The practices or the regulations we put forward, like what's in this book, Mr. Speaker, that's not worth the paper it's printed on unless we have the resources to manage it properly. Mr. Speaker, the age distribution of the Norwegian forests has been at the centre of attention over the past 30 years. Both forest owners and the government have worked towards an ideal age distribution, and they hope to achieve this goal by clear-cutting and immediate replanting. In some areas, especially pine forests, the regeneration is natural, and it's based on seeds from trees in the forest. In other words, the seed fall off the trees, and that regeneration is natural. Where cutting is done, the forest owner is responsible for planting that area. Now, Mr. Speaker, this goes back to what we believed when I was a minister. If you cut a tree, you plant a tree. It's very simple mathematics. And the minister has made reference to some of the bigger harvesters today, like Stora, Irving, Mactara, Mercy. These are some of the larger ones, and there are other numbers that don't have the volume and they don't harvest to the degree that these larger ones do. For instance, Mr. Speaker, we've had an opportunity to tour the Irving operations in Nova Scotia, and there's nobody going to stand in this House, Mr. Speaker, and tell us that the Irving family are not good operators. They see on the horizon. They're not going to cut and rape the forest without seeing that there's going to be something in the future because they're going to be, they spent a large amount of money in this province, and they expect to be here to reap the benefits of the seed that they sow. Mr. Speaker, that's what I say. Where cutting is done, the forest owner is responsible for planting that area. And I think, Mr. Speaker, if the department is doing their job, they will monitor the operations and see that the replanting is done. In Sweden, about 70% of the timber harvested comes from clear cutting, and 30% comes from thinning. Mr. Speaker, regulation and legislation is the NDP approach to all issues, Mr. Speaker. Instead of taking a more proactive approach, that party would punish anyone who didn't fit within their view of their world, Mr. Speaker. I know the Ecology Action Centre, as the Minister had talked about, they have a role to play in the province, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, there has to be a level playing field with industry, with the environment, with our habitat, and with the people who earn a living from our forests. Clear cutting in itself cannot be taken as an attack on biodiversity. In some areas, selective harvesting may be appropriate. In others, no harvesting. Now, Mr. Speaker, we talk about old growth where no harvesting should take place. In some areas, selective cutting would be appropriate. But, Mr. Speaker, to ban clear cutting as an option does not make sense, in my opinion. In case of an old-growth forest, credible case might be made for not allowing any type of harvesting. Mr. Speaker, and that may be something we can support, and I think all Nova Scotians respect and appreciate old-growth forests. Mr. Speaker, fundamentally, however, I believe this bill is maybe anti-forestry towards the harvesters or the people who make a living off our forests today. Mr. Speaker, forests are resilient. Logging in itself will not destroy the ecotourism system, Mr. Speaker. Do I agree with sustainable forest practices? We all do, Mr. Speaker. But in some cases, clear cutting should be part of the toolbox available to the harvesters. Mr. Speaker, I also believe this too can be a sustainable practice. Clear cutting smaller areas, for example, allows for greater diversity through strip harvesting. The name doesn't sound good, but what it does is selectively clear cut certain areas while maintaining others. This also can be a way to ensure diversity. Mr. Speaker, there are many issues that we can talk about relative to sustainable forestry. I think the regulations are there, and they, as I said earlier, they began with this position paper towards sustainable forestry. Unlike most Canadian provinces, the majority of forest land in Nova Scotia is privately owned, Mr. Speaker. Now, when we were in government, Mr. Speaker, and I was a minister, the Crown land under management by the province and under other harvesters, the level of cutting was sustainable. And I believe that is the same today because, Mr. Speaker, the industry is facing difficult times, Mr. Speaker. As we see our dollar climb in value, it's going to hurt the market for our lumber abroad. But, Mr. Speaker, I think this is, makes a good discussion, and I thank the honourable member for bringing it forward. But in closing, I just want to say, I believe this bill is short-sighted to some degree and should be part of a sustainable forest strategy rather than an attempt to ban clear cutting completely. So, Mr. Speaker, with those few remarks, I will take my seat.
The member for Halifax-Shabocto.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. We're debating Bill 30. Bill 30 is the bill that's been brought forward by my honourable colleague, the MLA for Hants East. It's a bill that is designed to control the practice of clear cutting in the province of Nova Scotia. I emphasize the word control because I've heard it misrepresented as a bill that, in fact, would absolutely and completely outlaw and ban clear cutting. This is not the case. The bill is designed to construct a presumption against the use of clear cutting. It essentially says that clear cutting should be the exception rather than the rule. It says that clear cutting should not be, as it is now, the prevailing method for harvesting forest. It should, in fact, be the method that is used only occasionally for harvesting our forest. And that's a very sensible bill. And I want to explain why it is that we've brought this bill forward. I heard comments from the Minister of Natural Resources to the effect that we ought to consider the question of clear cutting in a context. And he said that the ideal of sustainability, which he said that he and his government subscribe to, he said that the ideal of sustainability should be looked at in a wide context. Well, I want to look at that wide context in a slightly different way than the minister suggested to us.
Thankfully.
Now, this is the government that promised a green plan for the province of Nova Scotia, and it promised that green plan for the third year of its mandate. Well, we're in the 4th year of that government's mandate, and there's no sign of that green plan. And during estimates recently, I asked the different ministers who are responsible, where's the green plan? Well, they said, it's still being studied by an interdepartmental committee, and maybe we'll get around to it. You know what? For a government that is so predominantly made up of MLAs, not the Minister of Natural Resources as it happens, but is so predominantly made up of MLAs that come from rural areas, this government has consistently ignored the needs of rural areas in the last 4 years. And I want to give you some examples because that is the context within which Bill 30, brought forward by the member for Hants East, should be regarded. I think about things like the betrayal of communities time and again. I think about the betrayal of the community of Digby Neck by this government standing aside and not doing anything to get themselves in the way of that mega quarry proposal down there on Digby Neck to take away our basalt. I think about offshore exploration around Cape Breton and the extent to which this has been problematic for communities all over Cape Breton. This government has done virtually nothing to stand up for those communities up there. I think about aquaculture proposals in Northwest Cove and various other places around Nova Scotia where the local communities don't want them, but some company wants them, and so this government steps aside and says, we're not going to do anything. They cave right in. I think about the damage that's being done by all-terrain vehicles, by ATVs in the remotest parts of this province, and this is a government that says, we'll study it. Well, they've been studying it for several years. They've had an interdepartmental committee. And the latest thing they're doing is they're going to fob it off for voluntary planning to do something about, but that's study it again. I think about proposals for additional protected areas, things like Egg Mountain. These are proposals that have been well documented, studied, researched, that are in front of this government and that they've done nothing about. I think about our coastal properties, and I think about access, traditional access to recreational properties, to beaches, to the prospects that we enjoy around in our coastal province that are being interfered with, and this government again does nothing. I think about drought in agricultural areas, and what's happened. This government has allowed those drought conditions to prevail in rural areas, in the Valley, in Pictou County, particularly in parts of Cape Breton, for the last several years that have been particularly hard years, and what's happened? Nothing. And that's the context within which I think about the necessity for sustainability in the forests and therefore the justification for this bill coming forward in this form. It's because what we see from this government is what in the forestry context is known as talk and log. Talk and log means that all the stakeholders are invited to roundtables to discuss the future of the forests. And these roundtables often have interesting names. Sustainability roundtables, future of the forestry roundtable. That kind of label is put on the discussion process, and it goes on interminably. But you know what? While that talking is going on, the forestry companies are out there clear-cutting every last hectare of land that they can get access to.
Knock her down.
Now, that is exactly what's going on in Nova Scotia. That is exactly what's going on in Nova Scotia, and it has been documented. It has been documented very thoroughly. Now, a minute ago, or a few minutes ago, the minister said that he was going to table a newspaper document. I don't think he did, but I will table something. I asked the page to come here and get it. Thank you very much. This is the most comprehensive study of what has gone on in Nova Scotia's forestries that's up to date. This is the GPI Atlantic study from November of 2001 called the Nova Scotia Genuine Progress Index Forest Accounts. And the extracts that I have tabled should be read into the record. I think I've tabled them on other occasions. I certainly know that my colleague has tabled extracts from them. But anyone who's interested in knowing what's going on in forestry in Nova Scotia should pay attention to that. And I will now read into the record, Mr. Speaker, extracts from this because they say clearly exactly what it is that's going on in our forest industry and has been going on for years. I quote, "A long history of high grading, removing the best trees, land clearing and clear cutting over more than 2 centuries has severely degraded the province's forested natural wealth. The ecological integrity, health, and economic value of Nova Scotia's forests have continued to decline sharply since the 1950s, when the Department of Lands and Forests inventory noted that the quality of the province's forests had already decreased substantially." End of quote. Now, you know what? That takes the long view of observing that over 2 centuries there has been huge decline, and that has been documented time and again. And this goes on because they point out the indicators. Major losses in age class diversity is an indicator. Natural species diversity has also declined. That's another indicator. Here's what they say. Here's another quotation. Quote, "The rate of cutting in Nova Scotia has doubled over the past 2 decades by volume, and in the last decade alone, the actual area clear cut annually has doubled. 99% of this wood is harvested by clear cutting." I'll repeat that for the minister because he doesn't seem to have absorbed it. 99% of this wood is harvested by clear cutting. Their conclusion is that, quote, "the current annual rate of cutting is unsustainable." It's unsustainable. That means it can't go on. And you know what? You know what? I've heard comments from other speakers that suggest that opposition to clear cutting has something to do with admiring the view. Well, you know what? Clear cutting is ugly, but that isn't our reason for opposing it. That isn't the point. Environmentalism isn't about admiring the view. Environmentalism is an alternative view of different economic sectors, and in this case, the forestry sector. And what we're saying is that if we want this sector to continue to be healthy, to achieve health, because we don't have it now in Nova Scotia, we shouldn't blind ourselves by the fact that we are cutting so many trees. This is exactly akin to what went on with the ground fishery. They kept taking in fish, and of course they were able to sell the fish and make money at it. And it looks good. On the balance sheets, it looks good. But you can't do it forever if you're over-harvesting. And the over-harvesting that went on in the fishery ended up in the collapse and economic harm to the provinces that were so heavily invested in it. And if we don't take the lesson for our forestry, we'll end up in exactly the same situation. And it's not because we don't know it's coming. We can foresee that it's coming. And the 11,000 people who make their living in whole or in part from forestry activities in Victoria County, in Queens County, in Lunenburg County, in Colchester County, and in part here in Halifax Regional Municipality will be right out of luck. And I don't want them to be. I don't want them to be. I recognize that mechanization and clear cutting have cut back on the number of jobs per volume of wood harvested. This is not a good thing. Those people are already in a difficult position. What I'm saying is that we had better change our economic approach to forestry. This is a question of an economic approach. Never mind that it causes soil siltation, never mind that it's bad for the streams, never mind that it reduces the ability of the forests to act as carbon sinks. It's bad economics, which is the language that that minister says that he understands, but he isn't taking the steps to act upon it. This bill offers the minister and his government the opportunity to take some solid steps to actually protect the forests and protect those workers whose jobs and livelihood are attached to the forestry. The minister is missing out here, and he is failing to live up to his obligation to protect those people. I'm not talking just about protecting the trees, and I'm not even mentioning the habitat, although this is important, because there are a whole variety of other associated, and I would say not just interesting, but economic activities associated with forests. They rely upon them. I don't think the minister even knows what a forest is. He looks at forests and he thinks it's a bunch of trees. A forest isn't a bunch of trees. A forest is a complex ecosystem in which all elements hang together, from the microbes to the birds to, I heard the minister mention, spiders as well. This is true, but he doesn't take it seriously. He doesn't understand that they have to be protected. And one of the ways in which to protect them is to take action as suggested in Bill 30. The steps that have been taken by this government are minuscule. Now, the one solid fact that I've heard the minister put forward is the observation that in Nova Scotia, unlike many other provinces, a lot of the land base is privately owned. But you know what? So what? It doesn't matter that the land base is overwhelmingly privately owned here. The job of the government is to regulate where appropriate. The job of the government is to step in where appropriate and tell private owners how they have to manage their lands, because there is a common interest that we all have. And the trouble is that for individual owners, it's very tempting for them to simply let people come in, as contractors often offer to do, and clear cut on their land. I would ask the minister to talk to his colleague from Colchester North, who owns land quite adjacent to my land, or within a mile of my land, because someone went in and clear cut right beside his land. And does he like it? He doesn't like it. He thinks it's terrible. You talk to the member, your colleague from Colchester North, and it's not just because it's ugly. He knows that it's bad forestry management, but it's going on all over this province, and that minister is not doing his job to stand up for rural Nova Scotians, and to stand up for the ecosystems, and to stand up for the jobs that depend on forestry here. So he better talk to his colleague from Colchester North, because he'll get a different perspective. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Here, 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 here.
The member for Yarmouth.
Could you tell me how much time's left?
30 seconds.
30 seconds. Well, Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to stand and speak on Bill 30 to let the members opposite know that harvesters, landowners, and mill operators in my region of the province are working cooperatively together to reforest our forest after they do the cutting. And Mr. Speaker, they are trying to send a finished product from Nova Scotia all around the world. Stamped finished product from Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, Bowaters in the province of Nova Scotia.
Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. The House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Things seem to have become a little bit animated. Mr. Speaker, would you please call resolution number 1323?
Resolution number 1323. The member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Please stand and say a few words on this resolution. Maybe this time the member from Chester St. Margaret's will actually get to his feet and get engaged in something, as opposed to being the chief apologist for the government down that way, Mr. Speaker. But you know, Mr. Speaker, what we're here today to talk about in real direct terms is the implementation of the Dorsey report. It's a report, Mr. Speaker, that was not the conception of somebody outside this House. It wasn't done by a group of people that got together outside and decided, you know what, we think there should be an overhaul of the workers' compensation system. What the Dorsey report in actual terms is a mandated report from the legislation surrounding the Workers' Compensation Act, Mr. Speaker. And I just, with the indulgence of the House for a few minutes, I want to give a brief description of those that made up the Dorsey report, because I would hopefully, for once in my life, make a cogent point on this, Mr. Speaker. That being, the chair was James Dorsey, Mr. Speaker. He's a grad of Dalhousie Law. He was chair of the WCB in British Columbia. He was active on the Federal Canadian Labour Relations Board, Mr. Speaker. Brings a wealth of knowledge. Michael Power is a lawyer with Power and Dempsey, Cooper and Leaf, Mr. Speaker, and Bridgewater, and You know, he was a member of the Select Committee on Workers' Compensation with myself, plus he's been active in representing workers with claims against WCB. Janel Hazelton, who is now the president of Nova Scotia Nurses Union and has a background, obviously, in healthcare and was on it. Carol McCullough from the Construction Association of Nova Scotia brings a wealth from that injury, plus from a management perspective, Mr. Speaker. Gary Penny from the Cape Breton Injured Workers Association, Mr. Speaker, who is also a former board member of WCB. Steve Rankin, a former president of the Cape Breton Development Corporation. He was there representing Canadian Manufacturers of Exporters Association. Bob Cook is a healthcare professional, Mr. Speaker, and he is the CEO of Nova Scotia of Healthcare Organizations, Mr. Speaker. And the last person I'm going to talk about on that board was Betty Jean Sutherland, who represented Nova Scotia Federation of Labor, who has a wealth of background in healthcare issues. It relates to workers, but she does work in the healthcare field and long-term care, Mr. Speaker, and has been actively involved with workers' compensation. So, Mr. Speaker, the reason I laid out those names is because what it does tell you is that the people that put the Dorsey report together were all qualified people to sit in that board. They were not heavy-sided with labor or management or one sector or another. What they were was people with a common goal to fix a broken system, Mr. Speaker. It's as simple as that. And what this report, and I have it on my desk in front of me, and it's been tabled in here many times before, so I know I don't have to table it, Mr. Speaker, but what this report comes up with, as I stated, was the system is broke. And the stakeholders say this is how it has to be fixed. But does government take that document and say, thank you for your hard work, we're going to implement this report? No, the government doesn't do that. The government doesn't do what I would say would be the sincere and prudent thing to do, is to implement a stakeholders report. Instead, it re-delivered the chickens back to the hen house. It put them in there, and then it brought the fox in. And what it did by bringing the fox back in, it gave it to the board. Now, there's an institutional bias by the board. And I don't know, I'm not going to say anything derogatory about board members, the chair, or even the CEO. That's not what I'm here for today, Mr. Speaker. What we're here for is to say, why in God's name would you take it from here to there? It was an outside examination of what was wrong, and then you bring it back in-house and say, tell us more, see if it's true. Well, you know, Mr. Speaker, as I said in a question earlier today, that there's probably no other organization of government that's been tinkered with more in my short time in this House than workers' compensation, Mr. Speaker. Just previous to my time in this House, the then Minister of Labour, Jay Abbas, brought in what most people refer to as the Abbas Bill. And what the Abbas Bill effectively did was take us away from the old CRS, the old clinical rating system, to a wage loss system, Mr. Speaker. And what it did, it ended up giving us a whole other layer in the workers' compensation system. And then what do we have in that other layer is the Hayden decision, which clouds things again. But, Mr. Speaker, the Dorsey report goes a long way to resolving a lot of this, Mr. Speaker. I want to talk about, you know, its treatment of people that were left out because of another Liberal bill, Bill 90. The people that were in the appeal system that had a problem, but because they didn't have an appeal in by a certain date, were not allowed benefits through the Bill 90. Because although they do, everyone recognizes that they have chronic pain. The bill says, well, we know you got chronic pain, but you didn't have an appeal in by this date, therefore we don't recognize you. You're out on your keister. You got nothing. Makes absolutely no sense. But yet this government is going to sit on the Dorsey report and say, look, we've had focus groups. Minister, the Dorsey Committee is your focus group. You go through it, you look at the summations. They're your focus group. You don't need to go and waste more valuable premium spent at WCB in getting another opinion. Wasting, I would say, the precious dollars that come into that could be going to help injured workers, but instead is going to help these so-called researchers do focus groups again. We know what's wrong. Injured workers are telling you what's wrong, Minister. We don't need to go back there. We don't need a group on the other side of a two-way mirror telling us what's wrong. What we need is action. Minister, you could do a lasting legacy in this House, and it would be a legacy that injured workers would be talking about for years. And I don't say this to you by way of gratifying yourself, but just by being able to say you did the right thing. And the right thing in this case, Mr. Minister, is very simple. Is stop the shenanigans that people are doing around the Dorsey report. Implement it, if for no other reason, that it's the first consensus document in the last 15 years that come out of any kind of study of WCB. I know the special committee on all-party committee on WCB tried to get a consensus, but I mean the ink wasn't dry on that report when people were backing out of it. Your own party backed out of it because they had said they were the first ones out of that consensus document. They said there will be no universal coverage. They backed out so that all deals were off, Mr. Speaker. That's what happened with Bill 90 and the Select Committee, Mr. Speaker. So I believe that, Minister, you have a responsibility. You have a responsibility to the injured workers in this province. You have a responsibility to the employers in this province. Every time in the last 10 to 12 years that this act was looked at, it's resulted in fewer and fewer benefits for injured workers. And that's wrong, Mr. Speaker. We have some of the largest premiums of any province, Mr. Speaker. That's wrong. But you know, there's a whole historical problem that's caused that today's debate does not permit me to get involved with because it would just take up too much time. But Speaker, through you to the Minister, that he's got to realize that more study is not what's needed here. What's needed here is action. You know, we saw how injurious it was to injured workers when they were told Bill 90's coming, yet the board still pursued what was referred to as ADR, the Alternative Dispute Resolution. They knew that there was some form of box coming around chronic pain, but the board continued to go forward with, I would tell this House today, inadequate compensation to people. And these people took this through ADR, Mr. Speaker, because they were literally starving. They were losing their homes. But the board, with the blessing of the then government, allowed this to go forward, and that was shameful. You know, people still come to my office today and say, look, I made this settlement. Can you help me appeal it? And, you know, we try, but the reality is they signed away all of their rights through the ADR process. And now we have people out there suffering through that. We have people suffering through the fact that because of a date on the calendar, although everybody admits that they have chronic pain, are not allowed. We also are well aware, obviously, that in front of the federal courts as we speak is a challenge to Bill 90 as it relates to chronic pain. One could only hope that would be successful. But not relying on that, I believe, again, there's a fix for that in the Dorsey. I believe that, you know, that if the government would do the right thing, the heck with the studies, sit down, look in a way that we all know Dorsey makes reports. Everybody agrees with it, all the stakeholders. Why delay any further? Implement Dorsey, and I think we'll be well on our way to fixing the workers' compensation system. Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, have our times changed, have they?
Yes, they have. The time has changed because of a point of privilege which was raised and then added on, but still the same amount of time.
Okay, that's great. Mr. Speaker, I'm very, very pleased to rise in my place and to speak on the resolution that we have before us today, which deals with the Dorsey report and, of course, the Workers' Compensation Board and the Workers' Compensation Act. Speaker, as I said during question period, when a question was put to me regarding the Dorsey Commission report, that I have, fortunately or unfortunately, had a long association with the Workers' Compensation Board and the Workers' Compensation Act. And as a matter of fact, as I said before, the member from Cape Breton Nova and myself have probably spoken more in this House in years past on workers' compensation than any other members, I think, for a long, long time. We were partners in a couple of excursions, I think, or maybe even 3 around the province, speaking to workers, both injured and on the job, to speaking to occupational health and safety groups, to speaking to the medical fraternity, and most of all, speaking to workers who believed that, and probably rightfully so, that they had been shortchanged by the workers' compensation system. As a result of the second to last select committee that I was on, Mr. Speaker, I was Minister of Labor at that time, and when we came back, we drafted a new Workers' Compensation Act. And this was an entire rewrite, Mr. Speaker, of the Workers' Compensation Act. And with great pride and great fanfare, I introduced it to the House, and I couldn't understand the uproar that broke loose when I introduced that piece of legislation. Mr. Speaker, it had some things that were kind of revolutionary. We were going to have universal coverage, as for instance, under that act. We were going to do away with the meat chart in that act. We had a number of things in that act, Mr. Speaker, that finally come to pass. But at that time, however, the political opposition that we had were not at all happy with the act, and finally, in somewhat desperate straits, I withdrew the legislation, and we went back to the drawing board, and once again came forward with some minor changes to the act, Mr. Speaker, which didn't satisfy anybody. And I agree with whoever it was, and I forget whether it was from that side of the House or that side of the House, during question periods, it said that the time of tinkering with the act is over. I mean, we do have to make some very substantial changes to that legislation. And now I come to the point that is made, of course, by the opposition and by the people who I just met with, Mr. Speaker, a number of people from the injured workers groups around the province. And that is why the delay in the transition from a recommendation to action. And the reason for the delay is, quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, is that there are substantial changes required to the Workers' Compensation Act in order to affect completely the Dorsey recommendations. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to stand up here today and tell you that we're going to endorse every one of the Dorsey report recommendations, but we're going to try, and we'll certainly enact legislation that will indeed give power to most of the recommendations in the Dorsey report. Mr. Speaker, the complaint that we hear continuously is that there's something functionally wrong with the Workers' Compensation Board and with the Workers' Compensation system and with the way that people are treated. And I think, Mr. Speaker, that as a person who has a small office in a small rural area, I'm sure, like most other members of this House, We get a lot of people who come into our offices who say, you know, I cannot get reasonable, fair treatment from the Workers' Compensation Act. And sometimes, in fact, quite often, I imagine, in some offices anyway, the intervention of the MLA seems to stir the system up and something happens. And it shouldn't be that way. The system should operate in a fashion whereby a person applies for compensation because of an accident on the job. If it's legitimate and the pain and suffering are there, the person should be recompensed. I mean, there should be no argument about that. And that's why I'm glad that we have, to some extent, changed. I remember the first time, the first time I was Minister of Labor, one of the first things I did was to go up to the Workers' Compensation office and I asked the person in charge at that time, and I forget who it was before Stewie anyway. Yes, and I said, tell me, I said, why is it when I phone about a Joe Smith who comes in and has got a claim there, why when I phone up they say, well, we'll have to find Mr. Joe Smith's file. And then they transfer me to somewhere else, and they say, well, no, it's not on my desk, but I think it might be on somebody else's desk. And I said, why is it that you phone up and you're left hanging onto the phone forever before they finally, if they ever do, locate that file? So he showed me the system that they had, and this was before the computerized system went in on the Workers' Compensation Board, and they were on the second floor, the main floor, and in the basement. And the basement was just files stacked sky high. And the fellow said, you know, he said, when you look around here, what do you see? And I said, well, I see an awful lot of files. He said, that's right, but he said, we don't know who half of them belong to. Because the files go around and around in circles, and there was no tracking of files. And I couldn't believe it, and this was back in 1980. In 1980, that was the kind of system that they had at the Workers' Compensation Board. So I said to the fellow, I said, well, that's one thing that we have to look after is how the Workers' Compensation Board operates functionally as an office. And that is why I'm glad that the Dorsey report, 12 years later, is saying that one of the most important things we've got to address is the accountability of the system and the function of the Workers' Compensation Board in satisfying claimants who want to know what's happened to their claim, why is it not being approved, et cetera, et cetera. And Mr. Chairman, I think we are finally partially moving in the direction of having some better accountability at the board, and I would suspect that by the fall of this year, Mr. Speaker, that will be in place, as will be the draft legislation. On May the 26th of this month, there was going to be a two-day meeting, as I understand it. It's now being cut back to 1 day, and I'm going to find out why. For a meeting of stakeholders of the system to discuss the implementation of the Dorsey report and the coming into use of the regulations and the changes that will be required. You know, Mr. Speaker, it seems to me that once we've had that, I think we've got to say enough's enough consultation, enough talking. Let's get on with it. Let's get pen to paper and draft up whatever is required in the way of legislation, as I say, that will have to come before this House for enactment this fall. And I sincerely hope, Mr. Speaker, that I can rise in my place over here in the fall and introduce that amendment to the Workers' Compensation Act, because I think indeed it is, as somebody said, and I wrote it down, you can get a lasting legacy, I think the honourable member for Cape Breton Centre referred to it, if you can bring forward the recommendations of Dorsey and put them into place, and at the same time make sure that the board is accountable and it's being fair. And I think fair is the go word to all those who makes claims against the workers' compensation system. The Speaker was telling me I only have 2 more minutes. I'd just like to say that I believe, and maybe others don't, but I believe the Workers' Compensation Board today is better than it was the last time I was Minister of Labour. But it's only incrementally better. But we can take some giant steps forward, Mr. Speaker, and I look forward to doing that. Thank you.
The member for Cape Breton Nova.
Mr. Speaker, I'm interested in this resolution. This would be, I guess, a good time to play politics and say, look, they're now following us because we in this party brought this topic up every single week in question period since this session first began. But I don't know what he's talking about. But if he can go out the door, that would be good. Now, Mr. Speaker, the reason why I'm interested in this is not that I was part of the commission that drew up the report. I wasn't Labour critic for the Liberal caucus at that time. I was critic for the Department of Transportation and Public Works. But the leader of our party asked me if I'd take over Labour this past fall, and shortly after that, I got a telephone call from a constituent by the name of Diane Erickson, E-R-I-C-K-S-O-N, who lives at 25 Bennett Street in Sydney. And I know her well, and I know her mother and father well. And she said, what are you going to do now that you're a Labour critic? Because she had seen that in the paper in a little item about that big at the bottom of page 19. What are you going to do now that you're a Labour critic about the Dorsey report? And I said, well, what Dorsey is that, Tommy or Jimmy? And she said, no, she had never heard of Tommy or Jimmy Dorsey. That's before her time. But she said, there's a report on workers' compensation called the Dorsey report. She said, you should get a copy of it and start off from there. So I said, all right, I will. So I got a copy of it. That's not the copy, it's a copy, but it was one the same in size and content as that one there. And I looked through it and I saw that it was a very lengthy report. It had 8 authors. It had 190 pages, 390 pages. 390 pages of text, and it had 54 recommendations for reform. And it was, as the title says, a focused review of the Nova Scotia Workers' Compensation Program. So when the House session began this spring at the end of March, now having the designation of Labour critic, and I was reaching up there to see if I had a crown to wear for that, but I see that I don't. But anyway, I had the title. Well, I started raising this in question period to ask the Minister of Labour what he intended to do, because I knew from what had happened last fall that one of the recommendations contained in that report had been acted on. It had been a government bill, but it had received all party cooperation and was fast-tracked through the House. And there was a selfish reason for that, at least on my part, and that was because I didn't want to stop the workers that were going to get the checks from getting them before Christmas. I wanted to see that they would get them and not have it prolonged by extensive filibuster and time wasting up here in the House. So we got down to it. We passed the bill 123, just like in the Supreme Soviet, and it went into operation. And the beneficiaries did get their checks prior to Christmas. But that was only one of 54 recommendations, which raises the question of, well, what about the other 53? What are they going to do about those? Because if it takes them 1 year to implement one recommendation, then presumably it would take 2 years to implement 2, 3 years to implement 3, and so on and so forth, as long as they remain in power, until when even the Honourable Minister of Labour becomes an old man. By that time, they might have implemented recommendation number 12. You know, it doesn't seem like a good approach. I don't know why. I remember when the Honourable Member who invented the Morse code. I'm not allowed to call him by his name, but I can say he's the inventor of the Morse code. When he was Minister of Labour, and the bill that he was going to introduce was bill number 155. Somebody was going out the door talking about 90. I count higher, I count to 155. And when that bill was going to be introduced here in the House, through my espionage network, I knew that the bill had been prepared. I knew that the bill was drafted. I knew it had been approved by the Legislative Council office, but I could not find out where the bill was. And I used to tell people that I didn't know this as being true, but I said, I think that he has it in his glove compartment of his car because we haven't seen it in the House. Well, one day it was pulled out of somewhere and tabled here in the House and given first reading and then given second and third reading very shortly thereafter. And that's how Bill 155 got into full force and effect. And I would like to see the other recommendations of the Dorsey report similarly put into effect. Now, I realize it's a government decision on each recommendation. Do they want to respond by way of a bill? Do they want to respond by way of a regulation? Do they want to respond by turning thumbs down and throwing that recommendation into the filing cabinet or into the garbage can? That's their decision. But they haven't produced anything. And here we are at the tail end of this session of the House, and I've raised it in the House every week, and the NDP raised it today, and we still don't see any hope of action. And they say, wait until the fall, meaning wait until the election is over and waiting until presumably we over there are reelected. And once they get back in for another term, they're going to be even worse than they were this term because it's hard to teach old dogs new tricks. And some of them over there are getting to be kind of middle-aged specimens nowadays. So, I just don't have any faith in them when they say, well, when we get reelected, we'll do it then. That is a traditional put down, put off, procrastination, I think the psychologists call it. It's a P3. I don't know what that stands for. Psychology, psychiatry, and philosophy, maybe. P3, yeah. But anyway, they have their reasons for wanting to wait. We want action now. I would think that if there was an election coming and they wanted to demonstrate that they had some mettle to themselves, they'd table a bill. You could always, I'm not giving you cynical advice, but you could always let it die on the order paper, but at least you could say we tabled a bill, and if it wasn't for those terrible people in the opposition, we would have put it through. I mean, I know the tricks of this trade. I've been around it for a while. Yeah. But they won't do any of that. And so here we are again, going through the same exercise one more time, the same ritual. I was saying that when I got my appointment as Minister of Labour, that Diane Erickson called my attention to this report. I got it, so I think I have her to blame more than anybody else for having gone through what I've gone through and raising this issue over the last number of weeks. I also had a case involving Dennis Fougier, who lives nearby Diane Erickson at 455 Grand Lake Road. And Dennis Fougier was one of the beneficiaries of the bill that we passed last fall. And I have here a letter to him that I can table. I'll read from it and then I'll table it. And it will say that Bill number 155, this is dated November 26, 2002. Dear Dennis, further to my report of November 21st, 5 days ago, since then the bill in the legislature, Bill 55, has received 2 out of 3 readings at this point and will be given third or final reading the day after tomorrow. See, I know the future sometimes too. November 26, 2002. Now, this bill drastically changes and increases the amounts paid out on the Workers' Compensation Supplementary Benefits Program. Bill 155 will take effect October 1st, 2002. It provides for supplementary benefits with no cap at all, except half the industrial wage level paid in the province. This works out to about $15,000 a year. It actually worked out to $15,008 a year, or $1,250 a month. From this, they will subtract your current compensation pension and pay you the difference as a supplementary benefit.
Order, please.
It should mean that you will get...
Order, please. Just hold on one sec. Order, please. Thank you. Some of the members would take their conversations, please. Outside of the chamber, the member for Cape Breton Nova has the floor.
It will mean that you will get an additional $540 or so a month, effective October 1st. Now hear this, Mr. Speaker. I'm reading from my letter. I had the Minister of Labour, David Morse, do the arithmetic for me personally on your case. That's true. And he verified that $1,250 a month total figure will be payable to you, and says Bill 155 will mean your monthly income will increase by $540 or so a month and by $7,000 or so per year. Now that's action, Mr. Speaker. That's the kind of politics that gets you reelected. Much more so than paving potholes or getting rid of crying dogs. Or cats. Tell that to the candidate running for that party in Glace Bay. Now, official notification of these changes will be sent out to you by the Workers' Compensation Board once Bill 155 is passed by the legislature, which I expect to happen on Thursday, November 28th. Now, there's action for you of the type. I will be in further touch when Bill 155 is passed. It has all party support in the legislature, and I expect it will be passed unanimously. The Compensation Board assures me that if the bill is passed, they will gear up their check-writing machines and hopefully get these checks out before Christmas. Once the bill is passed, I will find out more details of payment from the Workers' Compensation Board. With all best wishes, and then it repeats, with all best wishes the second time, sincerely, Paul McEwen. Table that letter. Now, that's the kind of action you need to deserve votes in the ballot box. Action, not procrastination, not wasting of time, not finding excuses to avoid doing anything now, saying, well, it will wait until the fall, it will wait until next year, it will wait until the next decade. I'm pleased to see that today the minister announces that tomorrow letters will be sent out to participants and stakeholders to attend a roundtable conference, date of which I don't know yet. Even my espionage machine hasn't told me that yet, but I'll find it out. And when the machine is not dead, believe it, my friend. When I find that out, I will be watching proceedings with a very diligent eye. Because, Mr. Speaker, the point is that there wouldn't be that size of report on workers' compensation if there was nothing wrong with it. The commissioners would have reported back saying, A-OK. Signed 8 names to it, 1 single sheet of paper, and that would be their report. But they came back with 390 pages. Now, there must be something to it, Mr. Speaker. Maybe not every last recommendation is going to be carried out to the letter. But out of 54 recommendations, I'm sure that at least half of them, probably more than 3/4 of them, are soundly justified. Maybe all of them. Most of them. All right. The minister agrees with me, most of them. So my message here today on May the 14th, 2003 is get on with it. I'm not going to belabor that. I'm not going to play politics. I was even prepared today to commend the NDP, if you can believe it, for having made this an issue today, after we had every week since the House began. And I would commend the government also, as I did last fall, when they brought forth Bill number 155 to do what I just described to the House, because that's what politics is about, helping people, not turning your back on their problems. Now, I don't know how much time I have, Mr. Speaker, but I think I've probably taken enough. And I think I'll rest my case on that note.
The member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to have a few moments to speak on the resolution that my colleague from Cape Breton Centre initiated. I was glad to hear the words of the Minister of Labour and Environment, I guess it is now, and the member from Cape Breton Nova. And as the Minister of Environment and Labour noted, both he and the member from Cape Breton Nova have probably debated workers' compensation issues probably more than any other 2 members, obviously, in this House or any other assembly we've probably had. It's been an issue that clearly has always been front and center with a lot of constituents in Nova Scotia. As the Minister of Environment and Labour noted, there's not a member in this House that doesn't have someone come forward who has concerns about workers' compensation and is seeking assistance. I want to take a couple of minutes to talk about my understanding of the workers' compensation system, having heard particularly from the member from Cape Breton Nova. The member's right. This is an issue that needs to be dealt with immediately. We have already been dealing with it 14 months since the report came out. The report was initiated long before that. Many of the injured workers and other stakeholders in the system are desperate for changes in the system. And when the Dorsey report came out, they were encouraged to see what was being recommended. And they thought, here is some good news for us finally. Here are some issues that we would like to see addressed. And let's get on with it. And what we've seen from this government is delay, delay, delay. Mr. Speaker, Time for delay is over. I'm glad to hear that now we're moving forward with more stakeholder consultation. I'm glad to hear the words of the Minister of Environment and Labour that the time for consultation has ended. We've consulted enough. A little bit more might do, but it's time to start moving forward with these recommendations. And when you look at the recommendations, Mr. Speaker, I might say that they're based on the questions that were originally given. I forget how many there were, 30 or 35 questions that were originally given to the commission to look at, the Dorsey report. But, Mr. Speaker, clearly there still needs to be leadership from the top. And this is a government from day one that has not shown leadership on issues of workers' compensation and workers' safety and health. Let's be clear. One goes hand in hand with the other. Anytime a government provides regulations and enforcement that prevents a worker from being injured, that's one less injured worker, that's one less person that has to claim compensation, Mr. Speaker, and that should be the goal of every government. Yet from the first day, and in fact it was this minister's other time as the Minister of Labour, back when they first won election back in 1999, when he immediately stopped passage of regulations on Occupational Health and Safety Act, Mr. Speaker, regulations that would have gone very far in providing modern, harmonized rules with other provinces in Canada to ensure that Nova Scotian workers had decent regulations for protecting them so they do not get injured. And I'd be remiss if I didn't note that, Mr. Speaker. But I think what's also important is to remember Bill number 90. And I know the member from Cape Breton Nova seems to have some sort of absence of memory with regard to Bill number 90, so I think it's important to put on the record exactly what that bill was dealing with. And Mr. Speaker, what goes back before that, when I was a workers' advisor representing injured workers, Mr. Speaker, there was a court case that came down that specifically identified that what the system that had been created under the Workers' Compensation Act passed by the Liberals in the mid-1990s said that there were concerns with it. I think it's called the Pre-Hayden Group, Mr. Speaker. And with that, Mr. Speaker, there were certain dramatic changes based on that court case that were going to have to be made to the system. And there was only one thing that was going to stop that decision. That decision was good for injured workers in Nova Scotia. It was good for injured workers with chronic pain. It was good for injured workers in Nova Scotia. But, Mr. Speaker, only one thing that was going to stop that decision from being implemented. Only one thing. It wasn't Workers' Compensation Board that could stop it. It wasn't employers that could stop it. There was only one thing that could stop the full implementation of that decision, and it was the legislature, the House of Assembly of Nova Scotia. And we were in a minority government. And in that minority government, the Liberal government brought forward Bill number 90, and with the support of the third party at the time, the Progressive Conservative Party, they passed that bill with changes that basically gutted that court decision and said injured workers in Nova Scotia with chronic pain aren't going to get the benefits they deserve. That was a shame. And our party protested it at the time, did our best to try and make sure the changes would not be put in place that affected injured workers negatively, yet the Liberals as a government and the Tory opposition sided with it, and in the minority government was one of the major pieces and only pieces of legislation that were actually passed. And why? Because the decision of the court that came down in favor of injured workers could not stand, and the government and the third party at the time would make sure it would not stand. And that's a shame, Mr. Speaker. And now we have a Dorsey report that has come out over a year ago, and it identifies some very good recommendations, and I want to talk for a few minutes on those. And I've had a chance to read it, but I was refreshing my memory of it while listening to the other members speak, Mr. Speaker, and there's a couple of points that came up that I thought were particularly interesting. One was the earning replacement benefit, both temporary and permanent, the TERB and PERB as it's called in, or TERB and ERB, I think it's called in the system. Yes, thank you. The issue with it, Mr. Speaker, is that when they're calculating it, and this is a trick that the Workers' Compensation Board has used quite often. I'm glad to see the Dorsey report deals, and it's one of the recommendations I am surely hoping that the system will address. Because you would have these caseworkers that when a worker was finally identified as having a permanent injury, they would then calculate how much their earning loss was. I don't think anyone would dispute that the earning loss system is a better system. It's based on not, if you lose a finger, but you can still work as a carpenter or as a lawyer or what have you, Mr. Speaker. In those circumstances, losing that pinky, does that result in your not being able to do your job? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But let's calculate it on how much income you're losing as a result of the injury. Good system. I agree with it as a concept. It's one that was all adopted in the 90s. But, Mr. Speaker, the problem is, in its implementation, caseworkers are supposed to look back anywhere from 1 to 3 years on the injured worker's work history. But in many cases, these are workers who work on a temporary basis or work part-time or because of seasonal work are only able to work for part of a year. And as a result, or maybe they just had, because of the circumstances, they just weren't able to get work on a regular basis in those 3 years. I've seen circumstances where I had clients, Mr. Speaker, who had good, well-paying jobs, but just happened over the past year prior to that, been in a situation that prevented them from earning a decent income. Well, Mr. Speaker, the Workers' Compensation Board would find a way to limit their earning that they would have to judge as the earnings that they would make. And they would do it based on this fudgy system that they would have, Mr. Speaker. And as a result, there are many workers who would, and I'll explain why it's the benefit of the board. Because the board, if a worker is designated as having a salary of $20,000 a year as compared to $40,000 a year, the board doesn't have to spend as much in rehabilitating that worker because that worker then only has to get enough training so they can go out and find a $20,000 a year job or be deemed to be able to get a $20,000 a year job, Mr. Speaker, and therefore the board has to only provide sufficient training to get to that point. If they have to get a $40,000 a year job to meet what they're deemed to have made before, the board has to provide more rehabilitation, more training, more support. And of course, the board, as the employer's insurance system, and let's be clear, that's exactly what it is. It is an insurance system for the employers, Mr. Speaker. As the insurance system for the employers, their job is to limit the payout of benefits. Not that different than auto insurance, really, in some ways. Mr. Speaker, the Dorsey report said there has to be a minimum amount that has to be provided, and I was glad to see that, and I'm glad to see that that's a recommendation, and I hope the board looks at that and creates a minimum that isn't farcical, is not a minimum that's going to result in people having to, be suffering as a result, but recognizes there has to be a minimum amount that reflects a real earning loss by those workers, Mr. Speaker, and I hope that that's something that happens. I also see the report talks about medical opinions. Mr. Speaker, that is an issue that as a workers' advisor, I saw time and time again. You would have reports from specialists, from general practitioners on behalf of workers saying the worker, and I'll give you a specific example, workers who would have a herniated disc. Workers that clearly, there were MRIs or CAT scans that show that they had herniated discs, Mr. Speaker, and as a result of that, they had doctors that were giving opinions saying there was a pinched nerve, they had sciatica, and as a result, there was clearly objective evidence that they had a herniated disc and deserved treatment and support for that. And yet the board would have their own medical doctors in-house look at it and find a way, surprisingly at times, I'd be shocked how they would masterly try and find an excuse to say, no, that's not good enough. They've got chronic pain. That's a soft tissue injury. They've had that for a year. Chronic pain, move them off the system. And Mr. Speaker, that's a problem with the system. I'm glad to see that the Dorsey report tries to address why the medical opinions, because in the end, what happens is those caseworkers rely on the medical opinions of their own doctors more than they do on specialists who are out there doing work, Mr. Speaker. And that's a problem with the system that I'm hoping the Dorsey report can at least begin to address. I think it's a bigger problem, one that needs to be addressed more thoroughly, but I'm at least beginning to see some evidence of the fact, some independent recognition that there's a problem in the board and how they deal with their medical opinions. Chronic pain generally, Mr. Speaker, I know I only have a couple of minutes, but I think it's important to note that he and the others on the commission, Mr. Speaker, note that the functional restoration program and the way chronic pain is dealt with directly is not working, has not worked, and I may note, this is something that most people may or may not know in this House, but there's a case that's been argued before the Supreme Court of Canada arguing that Bill 90 was unconstitutional in the way it treated chronic pain people. I think it's the Martin case. Mr. Speaker, if that case goes in favor of the Workers' Compensation Appeals Tribunal and the injured worker, Mr. Martin, it is going to throw a monkey wrench into the workers' compensation system in Nova Scotia once again, and we'll be back here debating it. And what our caucus said 3 or 4 years ago, I guess it's 4 years ago now, 1999, spring of 1999, about Bill 90 and its constitutionality, Mr. Speaker, could easily come true this summer if the Supreme Court of Canada agrees with Mr. Martin and the Workers' Compensation Appeals Tribunal. And yet, we walk around like the system is still perfect and the system has no problems. It has a lot of problems, Mr. Speaker, ones that need to be addressed, ones that Dorsey began to address. That is part of it. I agree. Let's get Dorsey going. Let's get those recommendations implemented. And I would suggest implement them all, because I think this was an independent report that came from all stakeholders that clearly identified problems with the system. For once, we had an independent analysis. And I may note that came from a review that was required under the system, Mr. Speaker. And I look forward to the government taking the time to continue beyond Dorsey to ensure the workers' compensation system works for workers, not just for employers, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I move the House to now rise to meet again on the morrow at the hour of 12 noon. The House will sit from 12 to 7:30. There will be no late debate by agreement tomorrow. And everybody understands the reason why, because of the demise of our former Premier John Savage. Tomorrow, I think what members are here, if we're having scrums or anything with the media, we would take them downstairs, Mr. Speaker, to the lower lobby. And we will not be sitting, the House will not be sitting on Friday, Mr. Speaker. We will resume sittings again next Tuesday at the hour of 12 noon, and the House will sit from 12 noon until 8 p.m. The business of the day tomorrow will be probably we'll start off with public bills for second reading, and we'll go through bills number 9, 17, and 52. And then, Mr. Speaker, we'll move into Committee of the Whole House, and we'll deal with the bills that we presently have in Committee of the Whole House. So with those words, Mr. Speaker, I move that the House to now rise.
Motion to adjourn. Agreed? House is adjourned until 12 noon tomorrow.